The room fell into a tense silence. The gavel struck, echoing like a warning shot across the chamber. Cameras zoomed in. Pens froze over notepads, and for a split second it felt as though time itself had stopped. Then came the interruption, loud, brazen, calculated. His voice cut across the microphone, dripping with arrogance, as if the very act of shouting down a colleague was his birthright. Gasps spread through the crowd. Some shook their heads, others leaned forward, already sensing that something unforgettable was about to unfold. She did not flinch, her eyes locked on him, unwavering, while the weight of his words hung heavy in the air. Every viewer at home could feel the imbalance of power playing out in real time, an entitled man trying to bulldoze his way through procedure, convinced he could shout her into silence. He thought he owned the floor. He thought his interruptions would leave her rattled, off balance, stripped of her authority. But he miscalculated. In that moment, with the nation watching, the clash was no longer about parliamentary rules or points of order. It became something bigger. It was about respect, about dignity, about whether the voices of women, immigrants, and those who had fought to be seen could be silenced by sheer force of ego. Every second of his arrogance became fuel for the storm that was coming. She inhaled slowly, gathering not just her breath but the power of every story like hers, the resilience of those who had faced down disrespect before, and then she leaned into the microphone. The chamber braced itself. The audience held its breath, because everyone knew this was not going to be an ordinary exchange. What she said next would set the tone for the entire battle. This was not just another hearing, not just another clash between politicians jostling for soundbites. It was a defining moment for how America chooses to see itself. On one side stood those who had spent their careers hiding behind titles, wielding power like a shield, convinced that intimidation could substitute for substance. On the other stood a woman who had clawed her way into that chamber not by privilege, but by persistence. Her presence itself was proof that America's story was still being written, not by the loudest voices, but by those who refused to be erased. The stakes stretched far beyond the walls of that committee room. To the millions watching from living rooms, phones, and laptops, this was personal. It was about their daughters who were told to stay quiet, their mothers who had been dismissed in boardrooms, their families who had crossed oceans only to be told they did not belong. Every raised eyebrow, every mocking interruption from him, carried the weight of generations of silencing. Every calm glance she returned carried the weight of generations of defiance. This was America's mirror, reflecting back an uncomfortable truth. Dignity was still contested, justice was still fragile, and equality was still treated as if it were negotiable. The chamber was not just a room anymore, it was a battleground. For the soul of democracy, could arrogance drown out truth? Could entitlement erase lived experience? Or would resolve, steady and unshaken, finally force the nation to confront itself? Each exchange between them tightened the tension. Viewers felt their pulse quicken, sensing the confrontation edging closer to something explosive. Commentators whispered about decorum. Analysts speculated about strategy. But the people watching understood what was really happening. This was not about policy. It was about power, who had it, who abused it, and who dared to challenge it in plain sight. And still, beneath her composed expression, there was a storm gathering. He did not see it, not yet. He thought this was a game he had already won, another chance to flex authority. But the truth was simmering, building toward a moment no one would forget. What happened next would not just silence the room. It would ripple far beyond the chamber and into the country's conscience, long before his voice thundered through the committee chamber. His reputation had preceded him. He was the kind of politician who wore arrogance like a second skin, striding into rooms as though they existed solely for his performance. His record was a trail of contradictions, carefully packaged for cameras but exposed in the fine print. He spoke of fairness while bending rules behind closed doors. He invoked patriotism while aligning himself with those who tore at the very fabric of democracy. And yet, somehow, he believed he could play both sides indefinitely, untouchable, immune to consequences. This was not his first outburst, nor his first attempt to bulldoze through procedure. Time and again, he had turned hearings into theaters of dominance, relying on volume instead of reason, spectacle instead of evidence. For years, he had treated oversight as a nuisance, accountability as a joke, and respect as optional. To him, interruption was not rudeness, it was strategy. He mistook intimidation for leadership. He believed silencing others was the same as winning, but behind the bluster, cracks were showing. His legal entanglements had stacked up like storm clouds on the horizon. Allegations of misconduct followed him like shadows, whispered in hallways, splashed across headlines, dissected in late-night monologues. Every scandal chipped away at the image he so desperately curated. Yet he pressed on, convinced that sheer bravado would shield him from truth. His arrogance was not confidence. It was fear in disguise, fear that one day someone would confront him with facts he could not shout down. That day had arrived. His repeated interruptions, his dismissive smirks, his thinly veiled contempt for those who challenged him, it was a mask for desperation. He needed control, because without it, his house of cards would collapse. He had no intention of debating with integrity, because integrity was never his weapon of choice. His weapon was chaos. His strategy was to exhaust opponents until they stumbled. But this time, the opponent he faced was not one to stumble. And therein lay the irony. For all his claims of strength, his empire was fragile. For all his shows of dominance, his insecurities were glaring. He had built his career on the assumption that no one would dare to confront him with the persistence and composure to outlast his tantrums. What he failed to recognize was that history has no patience for bullies. The louder he roared, the clearer it became. He was not the voice of authority, but the echo of corruption trying desperately to drown out truth. As he leaned back in his chair, feigning control, the chamber could almost sense the unraveling. The mask was slipping, and the more he fought to hold it in place, the faster it cracked. His downfall was not a matter of if, but when. And what he did not yet realize was that the woman across from him was about to deliver the moment that would define his legacy, not with volume, but with precision. Her story did not begin in the marble halls of government. It began in the quiet struggles of a household that believed in sacrifice, where every meal was stretched, every opportunity fought for, and every achievement carried the weight of generations. She was the daughter of immigrants who worked long hours so that their children might step into spaces once closed to them. They told her that dignity was not given, it was claimed. They reminded her that silence in the face of disrespect was not humility, it was surrender. Those lessons etched themselves into her bones, and now, standing in that chamber, they pulsed with every heartbeat. She was no stranger to being underestimated. In classrooms, she had been told to temper her ambition. In law school, she had been questioned about whether she truly belonged. In the early days of public service, she had faced the subtle smirks of colleagues who assumed she would crumble under pressure. But she never did. Each dismissal became fuel. Each obstacle became a stepping stone. She learned to outwork, outlast, and outthink those who doubted her. And with every victory, she carried not just her own pride, but the pride of families like hers, who had been told for too long that they did not have a seat at the table. Public service was never for her own glory. It was for the communities she grew up in, the neighborhoods where voices were often ignored, where dignity was too often denied. She carried their stories into every hearing, every committee, every debate. That was why his interruptions did not shake her. They reminded her of every time someone had tried to silence her, and they reminded her of every time she had refused to let them win. What made her different from him was not just her preparation, though she had mastered every detail of the law. It was not just her composure, though she had cultivated it through years of facing hostility without breaking. What made her different was that she represented something larger than herself. She carried resilience born of sacrifice, she carried authenticity rooted in struggle, and she carried a belief that truth, spoken with clarity and conviction, was more powerful than arrogance shouted through a microphone. The people watching could sense it. They saw in her the reflection of their own battles fighting for respect in workplaces, in classrooms, in the country they called home. They admired her not simply for standing tall, but for embodying the dignity that so many longed to see upheld in their leaders. She was not just ready for this showdown, she had been prepared for it her entire life. And as she leaned forward, her expression unshaken, the room seemed to recognize that history was tilting. He had his tactics, but she had her truth, and the moment she chose to release, it would turn a clash into a reckoning. The clash began like a spark, quick and sharp, but it did not take long before the spark caught fire. He leaned into his microphone with the kind of authority he assumed was uncheckable, his voice rising as he cut across her words again and again. Every interruption was sharper than the last, every mocking laugh dripping with contempt. He dismissed her points not with reason, but with derision, waving his hand as though her arguments were beneath him, as though her very presence was a nuisance to be tolerated. The chamber grew restless. Eyes darted between the two, measuring the imbalance, waiting for the inevitable slip. He wanted her rattled, wanted to prove that composure could be shattered if arrogance pressed hard enough. His smirks grew wider each time he thought he had gained the upper hand, his tone rising to fill the room like a storm cloud ready to burst. But she refused to meet him at his level. Each insult was met with calm, each attempt to derail her with interruptions was countered with the quiet strength of someone who had weathered louder storms. She did not need to raise her voice, because her silence between his outbursts spoke louder than his words. The contrast was striking, his desperation clawing at the air, her composure steady as stone. Still, the tension mounted. Viewers could feel it in their chests, that quickening pulse when conflict edges closer to eruption. The room leaned forward as if bracing for impact. His interruptions turned into mockery, his tones slipping into open hostility. He jabbed at her intelligence, questioned her authority, even threw in barbed comments that were less about debate and more about humiliation. He thought the louder he became, the more control he would seize. Yet she never wavered. Every time he spoke over her, she waited. Every time he tried to drown her out, she gathered her strength, letting his arrogance build a case against itself. What no one in that chamber seemed to realize in that exact moment was that he was not exposing her weakness, he was exposing his own. Each interruption revealed his fear, each insult revealed his insecurity. And while he mistook the spectacle for dominance, she understood that patience was her weapon. The breaking point was near, the atmosphere was heavy, electric, almost unbearable. He launched into yet another tirade, convinced this one would finally topple her composure. But as the chamber held its breath, all eyes turned back to her, waiting for her response. And what came next was something no one could have predicted. The chamber had grown heavy with his interruptions, his voice echoing like a drumbeat of arrogance. But when he finally paused to catch his breath, she leaned in with a calmness that instantly shifted the air. The silence was so sharp it could cut glass. And in that silence, she began not with anger, not with volume, but with precision. "Mr. Chairman," she said evenly, her voice carrying the weight of measured restraint, "I have sat here and listened patiently as my words were dismissed. My voice was talked over, and my expertise was mocked. But patience is not weakness, it is discipline. And discipline, unlike arrogance, does not collapse under pressure." The room stilled. The crowd sensed something building, a storm cloaked in composure. She allowed the pause to linger, her eyes fixed on him, her tone unwavering. "You have interrupted me 9 times," she continued, her words deliberate, each syllable striking like a gavel. 9 times you have chosen volume over substance. 9 times you have shown this room, and the country, that you cannot win with reason. So you resort to noise. But the truth does not bend to noise. The law does not bow to arrogance, and history does not reward those who try to bury dignity beneath insults. A murmur spread through the chamber. Cameras zoomed closer. He shifted in his chair, his smirk faltering, a bead of sweat beginning to form on his temple. Then she lowered her voice, drawing the audience in. So allow me to make this absolutely clear. I will not be silenced, I will not be shouted down, and I will not allow this chamber to forget the law that you seem so eager to ignore. She reached for the thick binder before her, flipping it open with steady hands. Legal Citation 10, she announced, tapping the page, confirms exactly what I have stated. Not only am I correct, but your repeated attempts to derail this point expose your disregard for the very principles you claim to uphold. The record will reflect this. The people will remember it, and no amount of shouting can erase it. The words hit like thunder. Gasps scattered through the crowd. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others stifled applause, but all eyes locked on him. His jaw tightened, his hands fidgeted. The confidence he had worn like armor began to crack. She pressed on, unwavering. What you call strength is nothing more than the fear of being confronted by someone you cannot intimidate. And today, that fear is on full display. The chamber erupted not in sound, but in energy. The silence was no longer heavy. It was electric, charged with the sense that a turning point had been reached. Every camera, every lens, every phone trained on his face, catching the flush of embarrassment he could not conceal. She leaned back at last, her statement delivered not as a scream, but as a verdict. Now, she said quietly, almost like a closing argument, let us proceed with facts, not theatrics. The effect was devastating. He sat back, struggling to muster his usual bluster, his body betraying the unraveling of a man unprepared for this kind of reckoning. For years, he had thrived on noise, but now he was being defeated by something he could never master: calm, uncheckable truth. And as the chamber absorbed the moment, as millions at home replayed her words in real time, a single thought lingered in the air. This was not just a counterattack. This was the moment that would echo far beyond the walls of this room. The debate was over, but the echoes were just beginning. Within minutes, the clip of the hero's counterattack spread like wildfire across social media. Hashtags surged to the top of trending lists, each one carrying a wave of defiance, pride, and vindication. Memes flooded the timeline, capturing the exact moment the villain faltered, looping it endlessly for the world to watch. The hero's calm stare became a symbol, the still image shared with captions that read like declarations: strength, dignity, truth. Commentators on late-night broadcasts could hardly contain their awe. One called it a master class in composure under fire. Another labeled it the moment the narrative shifted forever. On podcasts, analysts replayed the clip in slow motion, dissecting every pause, every gesture, and every word, marveling at how one response could carry so much weight. Even rivals who once dismissed the hero felt compelled to speak, acknowledging that they had witnessed something rare, an act of courage that transcended politics. Celebrities lent their voices to the surge, resharing the clip with messages of solidarity. Singers, actors, athletes, all declared their admiration, amplifying the moment beyond politics and into culture. For many who had felt invisible or unheard, it was not just a victory in a debate. It was validation. Immigrants saw their own parents in the hero's story, workers recognized their struggles in the hero's words, and young people found proof that standing tall against arrogance could shake the ground beneath the powerful. The villain, once so confident, was now a subject of mockery. The sweat, the stammer, the loss of composure captured in freeze frames and parodied in videos turned into an endless cycle of humiliation. Where once their words commanded fear, now they inspired laughter, and the shift was palpable. Power had slipped from their grasp, not through force, but through truth delivered with clarity. But beyond the trending pages and news cycles, something deeper was stirring. Families gathered around their televisions, replaying the moment. Students shared it in classrooms. Community leaders referenced it in speeches. The ripple had become a tide, and the tide was moving fast. For the first time in a long time, people felt the momentum shifting toward justice, toward a new kind of leadership. And yet, as the world rallied around the hero, a question lingered in the air. If one moment could unleash such shockwaves, what storm would come next? When the noise of the aftermath began to settle, what remained was not just a viral clip or a trending hashtag, it was a lesson carved into the conscience of a nation. The hero, standing steady in the storm, had done more than win an argument. They had reminded the people that power without principle is hollow, that arrogance crumbles before dignity, and that truth, when spoken with conviction, can silence even the loudest lies. The conflict had never been about two individuals trading blows on a stage. It was about something larger, whether justice could prevail over corruption, whether voices long ignored could rise against those who thrived on division. In that moment, the hero transformed from a participant in a debate to a vessel of something universal. Their story of sacrifice and resilience had become the story of millions who yearned to be seen, respected, and defended. Commentators could measure poll numbers and pundits could analyze strategy, but the real impact was measured in hearts awakened. People carried the lesson into their daily lives, teachers reminding students of their worth, workers holding their heads higher against exploitation, parents telling their children that dignity is never to be compromised. The hero had reframed the battle, showing that the fight was not just political, it was moral. And yet, what lingered most was not the villain's collapse or the audience's roar. It was the quiet certainty that the struggle for justice is never finished, that every generation must decide whether to bend to arrogance or stand with dignity. The hero had shown the way, but it was up to the people to carry the torch forward. As the lights dimmed on that chapter, the question left hanging was not whether the hero had won, but whether the nation was ready to follow the path they had illuminated. What we witnessed was more than a clash of words, it was a moment that stripped away pretense and revealed what truly matters. The hero did not just defeat arrogance. They reminded us that dignity and justice are not negotiable. That moment, the very one that has traveled across screens and conversations everywhere, was proof that truth has power when someone dares to speak it aloud. But this is not where the story ends. It is where it begins again with you. Every share, every conversation, every act of standing up for what is right keeps the spark alive. The movement for fairness and respect does not belong to one stage or one debate. It belongs to all of us who believe that no one should ever be silenced or diminished because of where they come from or who they are. So, if this moment moved you, do not let it fade. Carry it forward. Share it. Subscribe. Join a community that refuses to be quiet in the face of injustice. Because the louder we rise together, the harder it becomes for corruption to drown us out. And this, right here, is only the beginning.